what's happening with respect to, in particular, Russia, Ukraine, where we have some pretty good news. I think we want to get it stopped.
Ending the Russia-Ukraine war is proving to be a hard task for President Donald Trump. Things have only gotten more complicated as the US attempts to bring Ukraine and Russia together for peace talks. In the last 2 days, there have been separate talks in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, between the US and Ukraine, and then between the US and Russia, all under the same roof. While Ukraine continues to negotiate with the US is busy coddling Putin, and Russia is playing hardball on another level. Trump is not making things easy as he floats the idea of US ownership of Ukrainian power plants. Zelensky, meanwhile, remains trapped, fending off Russia on one side and American policy U-turns on military aid, support of the United Nations, and the pause on intelligence sharing on the other. So where does this leave each party, and what can we expect from these talks in the coming weeks? This is Shubhangi Sharma and you're watching Finepoint. Let's dive in. Here is what is happening. There have been talks in Riyadh to hammer out a ceasefire deal, a limited one for starters. The US first had talks with Ukraine on Sunday, and then it had separate talks with Russia on Monday. The Americans are basically mediating between the two warring nations. Earlier, Putin rejected a joint US-Ukrainian proposal for a full and unconditional 30-day ceasefire, opting instead to support only a pause in aerial strikes on energy facilities. But how they shall implement such a partial ceasefire remains in question as drone and missile attacks from both sides continue. Meanwhile, Russia is playing hardball. Ahead of the talks, Moscow warned that difficult negotiations lie ahead, even as Washington hoped that there could be real progress. The US wants a broad ceasefire by April 20th. Russia, however, is only focused on implementing the ceasefire around energy infrastructure and potentially reviving the Black Sea grain deal that Russia pulled out of in 2023. This deal was signed in 2022, brokered by Turkey, facilitating the shipping of Ukrainian and Russian farm exports across the Black Sea. Now, following the talks, the Russian delegation was reported to be in a good mood. Yet it is clear that the primary focus of the talks was simply safety of navigation in the Black Sea, and a deal could be finalized in the coming days. There are no breakthroughs otherwise when it comes to a larger ceasefire.
You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
We've all seen how tensions between the USA and Ukraine blew up in a public spat between President Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. That was when both teams were supposedly on the same side. So you can only imagine the deep divide when it comes to the USA's position and Russia's. Moreover, talks with Russia are still in their infancy, with Putin refusing to budge with maximalist positions like wanting to legitimize the annexation of Ukrainian territories in Donbass, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, and demanding that Ukraine should never be admitted into NATO. Being on the winning side with Ukraine's position dwindling, the Russian president has no reason not to project strength. Russia's position stands firm, while Trump has watered down Ukraine's position with his non-committal treatment. Now, Donald Trump has held 2 long phone conversations with Vladimir Putin and even suggested that the two leaders could visit each other's nations soon. The Americans are floating the idea of a US and Russia that work together on the global stage, hoping to reverse Russia's strong pivot towards China. Great power politics, that seems to be a priority for Trump. Russia, meanwhile, is showering Trump with flattery while driving a hard bargain on business, and the strategy is working. Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff, who met Putin earlier in March, believes that Putin wants peace, that he does not want to take all of Europe, and that he is not a bad guy, but he's super smart. He said all this in a podcast with Tucker Carlson. Witkoff also went on to reveal that Putin gave him a portrait of President Trump from a leading Russian artist, and that Putin went to church to pray for Trump when there was an attempt on his life last year. He said, and I quote, "When the president was shot, he, that is Putin, went to his local church and met with his priest and prayed for the president. Not because he could become the president of the United States, but because he has a friendship with him and he was praying for his friend." All this left Trump touched, according to Witkoff. Clearly enamored with Putin, Trump is giving diplomacy a wholehearted chance and playing a big public gamble while at it. He has relieved the diplomatic pressure on Putin and instead turned the screws on Ukraine, demanding repayment through ownership of Ukraine's critical mineral resources and its power plants. And while this is a clear strategy on Trump's part, it's yet to pay off. Attempts to coddle Putin with hopes to land a breakthrough deal are an expensive gamble, but Trump is caught between a rock and a hard place. If things turn sour on a personal level between Trump and Putin, it will be hard to go back and it will be hard to end the war in Ukraine. And if Trump does not put pressure on Russia, then the US may never land a decent deal for Ukraine, which would be a diplomatic and political embarrassment. Meanwhile, Ukraine is dealing with uncertainty on both sides. The fight with Russia has continued unabated, but at the same time, the USA's position has shifted drastically as seen in recent months. In February this year, the US voted against Ukraine in a UN resolution, joining the likes of North Korea, Belarus, and Russia, essentially refusing to condemn Russia. This was a staggering shift. Even India, which has consistently abstained from such votes, did not go so far. Then there's US military aid, which has been stopped by Trump, making Ukraine's position on the battlefield significantly weaker. The US was the largest donor of military, humanitarian, and financial aid to Ukraine so far, accounting for well over 50% of all aid to Ukraine. The rest has been supplied by Europe. But this halt in weapons supply is not the end of Ukraine's woes, as the US has also paused intelligence sharing with Kiev, another massive blow to its position on the battlefield. Not to mention the call for repayment through Ukrainian resources. These abrupt American policy shifts have left Ukraine and Europe scrambling to reaffirm their stance against Russia, while transatlantic unity stands fractured. This uncertainty is being exploited by Russia, which hopes that Western fatigue will force Ukraine into making concessions it wouldn't consider otherwise. The Ukraine war has entered a new phase, therefore, one where diplomacy is as contested as the battlefield. Russia continues to dictate the terms of negotiations, showing its readiness to continue fighting the war. Even as the talks took place in Riyadh, Russia and Ukraine were both dropping bombs on each other. While losing ground is not an option for Ukraine, Russia keeps gaining territory and neither side is willing to back down militarily. Unlike Russia though, Kiev's firepower as well as manpower are dwindling. For Ukraine, this is a dangerous moment. If Western support weakens, Kiev could be forced into a settlement that favors Russia. And if the war drags on with no resolution, Ukraine's economy and military will continue to strain under the pressure. For now, one thing is certain. More negotiations have not brought more solutions, only more uncertainty. The illusion of diplomacy persists, but there's a long road ahead when it comes to putting an end to war hostilities.